Thanks again, everybody, for coming. So this is probably our last webinar of the year. As we get into November, December, year end gets a little trickier for everybody to tie up the loose ends and prepare for the holiday season and attend something like this. So thanks for coming out. We still intend to do a lot more going forward in terms of collection system webinars, focus webinars, a lot of focus around the CLI-ECA regulations these days, and our industry certainly has a lot going on, lots of growth, lots of opportunity in terms of where we're going as a province and as a country. So yeah, looking forward to engaging with everybody as we move forward and work through those challenges together. Just a few housekeeping items. So if you've attended the webinars before, you've seen this slide before. If not, welcome. And just a few things. So typically our webinars consist of two parts. So we'll do a presentation, and then at the end, there'll be sort of a Q&A engagement part. And you can type in, you should see on the bottom of your screen the ability to type in either the chat or the Q&A window. Throughout the course of the presentation, you can do that, or at the end when we start the Q&A session. You can also put your hand up as we get to the end and go into that session. And we can take you off mute if you prefer to ask a question sort of verbally rather than type it out. If you do want to get a certificate of attendance, a lot of our attendees in the past are interested in getting their PEOP credits. So if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to email us at info@civi.ca, and we can issue a certificate of attendance for all of those that are interested. So just a quick intro about the company, about Civica. So a bunch of things that we do. I'll say sort of strategic planning around collection systems for owners and operators. As I mentioned already, the CLI-ECA regulations, anything to do with planning, maintaining, operating these systems. We try to give as much strategic advice and consulting as possible, asset management. Some of the other things that we do that maybe aren't directly related to what we're talking about today. We do a lot of work in inflow and infiltration, flow monitoring, sort of capacity assessment in terms of inspecting collection systems, modeling to assess capacity, a lot of master planning work that we have across water, wastewater, and stormwater. Basement and surface flood studies, and all sorts of kind of various water resources engineering to support municipalities and development. A little bit about myself. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Matt Malone. I'm the project manager and the VP of Business Development at Civica. So I have getting closer to 10 years, maybe 8-9 years of experience, both on the sort of public and private side. Most of my career has been focused on the sort of consulting side, contracting side, working collection systems. I'm currently the vice chair of the WEO Collection Systems Committee. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out and we can chat more about that at any point. And I'll pass it over to Ilmar, who's going to be doing the bulk of the load today and taking us through the presentation. So I'll pass it over to you, Ilmar, to do a quick intro.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, and hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here today to go through this with you. For those of you who may not know me, I've been involved in the municipal sector since the early 90s and working in private consultation, construction, and in municipal government for over 20 years. So have had the pleasure of experiencing our business from many perspectives, and hopefully can bring some value to you today in this very important topic. Thanks, Matt.
Awesome. So we'll do our first poll. We always like to tell you about ourselves, and we like to hear from you as well. So you should see a little pop-up come up to just ask what type of organization you work for. Typically we get a good mix of sort of, a lot of municipal folks, some government agencies, and then our partners across the consulting world and land development side as well. So NCAs, can't forget them. We typically have quite a few, and I think this is also one that the CAs are probably more interested in than I&I, for example. But we'll just give this a couple of seconds. I think we're getting most of the answers in. Okay, so it looks like we're got a good mix. 50-60% on the municipal side, some about 10% from sort of provincial government agency, another 20-ish% on the consulting contracting side, 10% on the CA, a couple land development firm folks as well. So good mix, and again, glad everybody could come out, and hopefully you get some good info and value out of the presentation today. I'll just end the poll. And with that, Ilmar, I'll pass the control back to you.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you. Okay. So the focus of our conversation, and it's really driven out of the ECA process and their requirements, the new or the rejuvenated requirements from MECP. And this topic is really focusing on the stormwater and sustainability with regards to dominant funding issues. So the presentation today is structured to go through the basics of stormwater management and where the priorities are, where the drivers, the cost drivers, the performance drivers are, and how all those elements come together to identify the cost of a program, and then ideally what funding strategy might look like, and how that translates into a sustainable environment, sustainable safety, and sustainable economics. And if there are people that are here that are more interested on the finance side, then this will provide you some engineering background. And for those that are more on the engineering side, hopefully there'll be a bit of financial information that'll be useful as well. So what is the impact to our stormwater system, and how are we recognizing these challenges? These headlines are very telling in the emerging pressures we are seeing in stormwater management. The media is taking an interest as well as these headlines become very, very prominent and dominant in our media. We're seeing reports of millions of dollars of unfunded programs and shortfalls and the scarcity of funding availability. And this is already becoming a very, very loud message in the communities. The idea of stormwater rate programs being floated more and more frequently, and councils becoming more interested in alternate funding sources and alternate ways of actually generating revenue for this and many other programs that are all competing for scarce resources. There's also a very real opportunity to link the need for new or increased charges to climate change. This is the time where changing environmental conditions cannot be ignored, and we're now taking action to recognize these needs and using these kind of programs to either mitigate risk or at least recognize the funding gaps that need to be closed. There's also a number of real and mounting costs in these programs. Many of the municipalities that have existing funded rate programs for stormwater are finding cost pressures and the need to increase these rates, sometimes substantially. In this case, over 100% over the next 7 or 8 years for this municipality. And these are relatively new programs, and it really is a combination of recognizing additional needs, recognizing shortfalls and system constraints that need to be addressed maybe sooner than initially anticipated. There is also skepticism in regards to the advocacy and protection of community resources. The politics of municipal management will be in the mix, and councillors and politicians alike are very interested in how public resources are spent and where the priorities are and what the right balance is. Then, of course, there's the community stakeholders themselves, the residents, the businesses, the properties that are affected by stormwater directly, and also by the rates or charges that may be applied to try to fund these programs. Every rate program is based on some structure of allocation and distribution of these costs, and creating a fair or fairly reasonable distribution of these costs is always a challenge. and every community has its uniqueness. And there's always a question around what could the impact be. In this case, there's outcry from the farming community around the relationship to the fees they're being paid and the services that they're perceiving to be receiving for those costs. I can tell you from our experience in the recent programs that we've helped implement, the outcries are generally not there and the interest is relatively low. But that is, again, part of listening to the community and trying to understand where their concerns are and addressing them prior to actually implementing a program. So just a little bit of background on stormwater and stormwater management for those that may be new to the field, or something that may be new to them. Stormwater management only exists to deal with urbanization. The impact of changes to infiltration and the increase of surface runoff drives the need to understand these impacts and to create the solutions to mitigate the impact to the downstream watercourses. And in these figures, you can see it's simply really just a question of hardscape and buildings that are creating more runoff, and the net effect to higher peak runoff volumes and earlier occurrence of peak flows, which you can see in the graph on the right. Pre-development generally being a longer, shorter, a lower peak and discharge curve, and the effects of development creating those higher early releases with the reduction in infiltration. And in the end, the stormwater management practices are to make best efforts to maintain that pre-development condition. And those assets that are required to do this are what costs us the money to create the programs, to sustain them, and to make sure they're functioning properly. Another interesting element of stormwater management is the dual drainage model. And we've done workshops on this topic in the past. And this is really just to bring to light, for those that may not be aware of the function of a typical urban stormwater collection system. Conveyance is a consideration both from a performance perspective and from the perceived impact to the community when roads appear flooded. And this is part of how the system operates. From an engineering perspective, we understand the concept of minor and major flow patterns. The minor typically being defined as the flows for a 5-year return period storm or lower. And that's the infrastructure that's in the ground that takes the water away from the community. And the major system is actually the road itself, the right of way, and the necessity to use this right of way as part of the conveyance system due to the real high cost of trying to do it any other way with the pipe infrastructure. And for the most part, the collection systems perform well, while community acceptance of the odd inconvenience in flood or flood conditions may be well tolerated. However, with the change in climate and increasing intensity and duration of storm events, there is obviously the perception or even the reality of increased flooding and poor performance, as would be seen from water accumulating on roadways. And where overland and surface flows remain within the right of way, the system is performing as intended. But as we know, and as things become more stressed, other things can happen. You can have backups in system. Illegal connections from private homeowners can result in basement flooding or other conditions that may be adversely impacted from right-of-way flooding, and that can also be attributed to perceived failing of the public system. A secondary impact is the inflow that will occur into the sanitary systems during the road flooding periods. And this can also create additional risks to the sanitary system, where manhole covers can be inundated and resulting in additional inflows to the system that can impact pumping stations and downstream sanitary systems and further aggravate the effects of wetter or higher flow events. Then, of course, there is the real failures in the public system, where anything that could happen on a regular basis that might actually impact our system performance will cost more money for the community through the need for maintenance and repairs. More public awareness is definitely part of the answer, but much more is needed to be done to stay on top of the rapid changes we are experiencing. So there are some good things that we can do and that we do. If the conveyance system is there to address the overland flow created by runoff, It only makes sense to reduce that impact of the hardscaping by encouraging infiltration and other retention solutions at source. Low impact development solutions create this opportunity and where viable are a great addition to mitigation and system resilience. And this slide provides you a number of typical LID features that are provided on typically on public side. There is rain barrel shown here. The interesting thing with these features is that they all do need a certain level of maintenance, monitoring, and confirmation that they're performing as designed. And that has to be done as part of a lifecycle management of the asset once it's created. There's also a bigger opportunity in the private side, where redevelopment and intensification of sites often requires the inclusion of runoff controls and storage. There are also emerging programs like in the city of Toronto, where they have a program called Rainscape, which is a community-based, not-for-profit program that delivers residential and small commercial on-site gardens and stormwater solutions with the long-term vision of becoming an Indigenous-led and run social enterprise. And these are wonderful programs that are starting to create more awareness in communities and for the homeowners that are really the reason why these systems are in place. End of pipe management of storm ponds. This is the dominant solution to stormwater quality and quantity control. And it's the wet pond that we see in many of the communities. And they're found, most every development constructed from the mid-90s is part of this solution. And really it's really coming out of the regulations that were introduced by the MOE in 1994 around stormwater management practices. So what does this mean? If you look at the 1990s as that time of bringing these types of systems online, many of those early systems are now, 30 years, approaching 30 years of service life. And although many municipalities have been actively maintaining these assets, for certain, there are some that may need more urgent attention as time goes on. The design is based on a number of conditions, including impact of specific rain events, flow control, and various storm return periods. And really, the purpose of the pond is to allow for buffering of the peak flows that come from the urban area, as well as space and time through a permanent water pool to allow for sediment to fall out of the water column and ideally reduce the load of sediment into the downstream environment. And the goal, if done properly, is to mimic or reproduce the pre-development flow conditions that were present prior to urbanization. So a little bit about service level considerations, and I've captured three key areas that we speak about often: environmental, community, and economic service level considerations. So these service levels are a consideration in balancing all the aspects of stormwater management systems, and each aspect has an impact to cost and performance. The environmental service levels are often regulated and monitored through programs like the ECA, the MECP ECA program, and are a cornerstone for the minimum level of service expected and to protect the local and downstream environments. Further consideration is the role of the community and their responsibility in understanding how these systems operate, their lifestyle and their use of the community, and how that could impact stormwater systems, and what they can do to help mitigate or minimize sort of adverse effects through their private side behaviors. Again, protecting the natural environment is a key aspect of this, and both the private and the public community has a responsibility here. And then from the community perspective, the community service levels are a further extension of the performance of the system. Private property flood protection, impact of public lands on private property where system constraints can cause adverse effects. This is obviously seen during high rain event periods where right-of-ways may become inundated or overflow into private lands, causing direct impacts, backup of sanitary or sewer systems that can create property damage and other effects from directly felt by the community. And then what the community can do, like programs like the Toronto Rainscape program, where their efforts or their contributions can hopefully mitigate or minimize these risks. And then the economic service levels are more an outcome of the others, but are still very important in controlling or understanding how these costs can be controlled and finding that right balance between investment and maintenance of these systems, as well as where the next best dollar should be spent. And it's always a question of the next best dollar, because stormwater historically has been a relatively invisible service in the community, unless we have had very disastrous events. And with that anonymity becomes it becomes challenging to find the funding resources where needs might not be directly seen in the community. And with that, there's questions like sources of funding, availability of reserves for future needs for these systems, the competing demands, and the compliance as a new driver, at least with regards to what we're seeing with economic, social, and regulatory changes. And as we've seen in the early 2000s with the Sustainable Water and Sewage Systems Act, as a result of Walkerton, those models were really focusing on the need for full cost reporting, cost recovery planning, and regular reporting. And as new legislation comes on board, and really, even though this legislation is focused on streamlining the process, it's also a wonderful way to bring some formality and move sustainability for stormwater systems more into the forefront. And that then can help drive funding, more stable funding sources and rate increases that can be then met to match future needs. So performance and costing is also another aspect around the notion of what the system is able to do. And in further considering the cost criteria, there's always a direct connection between cost and performance. With the collection system, there are some key areas to consider that would be the major performance markers that will also be potential cost drivers. And with the dual drainage approach to transmission, where we have both the collection system and the road right-of-way as those transmission vehicles, the community perception of road flooding and failed performance is an aspect that will benefit from community engagement and awareness. However, there will too be cost pressures where intensity and frequency changes will further stress assets and accelerate system failures and infrastructure damage. So identifying and planning for these risks will encourage investment and maintain the ideal reduce risk or catastrophe model. Again, more investment and encouragement in at-source control continues to appear to be the best next dollar invested, where these solutions are effective, maintainable, and remain functional after installation. So it's always that question of the next best dollar, again, with so many competing demands in the municipal environment. Other performance and cost considerations that may not appear storm-related, do include things like the winter maintenance programs, where decisions around road salt versus sand applications and the impact of the silt creation from these applications accumulating in the ponds, as well as inline infrastructure related to storage, can be further challenged where they're not properly maintained, and where they can be actually not necessarily forgotten, but not paid attention to in a frequency that would allow for proper performance in the long term. Ongoing maintenance and remediation planning is a critical aspect as well from a life cycle perspective, and often well managed where funding is available. If sources of funding are available to municipal planners and the finance teams that are preparing these plans, then things can happen fairly effectively in a sanitary and stormwater system. However, when funding becomes constrained, then the programs are very difficult to either create and launch or sustain. There's also the increased concern of the major system flows and how they impact sanitary systems, again, as previously mentioned, where those costs can be seen as a secondary impact of the poor performing stormwater systems. And when needed, increasing network capacity is also a costly last resort. Undersized or changing conditions or impacts due to flooding and the damage caused by flooding definitely drives those costs. And all these approaches lead to a more efficient use of funds and increased performance. Creating comprehensive programs around these and other tools to manage the stormwater system also creates clarity on true funding needs, And once those true funding needs are understood, it becomes easier to then justify and request those funds. And the next piece is around the end of pipe, the stormwater pond performance and cost management. Similar challenges and opportunities exist for the end of pipe as well, where routine maintenance, sediment and flow monitoring, capital planning for sediment removal, and general maintenance of these sites with regard to vegetation and signage are all required to be planned for and funded in the long term. Issues that can emerge in these decisions include community resistance to removal of the naturalized character that may be required when rehabilitating or cleaning these ponds. Impact to performance when overgrowth is present is also a reality. And the decision to allow for some level of naturalization as a feature of the community is always a possibility. However, there may be unintended consequences when naturalization goes too far. We had to remember, though, that in the end, these are engineered systems with a specific function that need to be maintained long after the completion of the development, and that any naturalization has to become part of the landscape, both functionally and aesthetically. And with the regulatory changes, with MECP's initiative in introducing the CLI-ECA program, there has been a substantial period of development and consultation, all with the intent on improving the approval process through a number of key factors, including the reduction of high volume approvals over low risk routine alterations, updating outdated conditions of the initial ECAs and earlier ECAs, the potential of duplication and overlap of some works as the older version of the ECAs were being issued, fragmentation of the system and losing sight of the overall system based on how the system was being approved, and inconsistent reporting requirements and parameters throughout the years of these ECAs being developed and updated. So with this new process, the province is well on its way of simplifying and creating more consistency for stormwater systems across the province. And the program has been well adopted, it appears to be well accepted, and is very well structured. So this too brings the need for renewed effort by municipalities to apply for new approvals and follow through the process with the creation of some critical documents such as the operations and maintenance manuals, pond performance monitoring programs, and the annual performance reporting that will document the mitigation and system improvements that will drive further funding needs. Matt, if I can take a quick break, I'm going to put this back to you.
Yeah, for sure. So this is a good intro, good segue into our second poll. Um, so I'll just launch this, and whether you're currently involved in or planning any sort of stormwater management studies to address the new regulations, is that ongoing? And a lot of, I think most, if not all municipalities have received sort of the marching orders to get in line with the new regulations. Some of you may not be in the municipal world, maybe on the periphery, on the sort of consulting side or contractor or land development side, but I'm sure you still have some, it still has some impact on you, and you may still be involved in some form or fashion to help your clients. So we'll just give this a few more seconds. I think we're getting pretty close to where we are, more majority of the responses. Okay, so it looks like about 50% are currently involved or planning studies to address the regulations, 25% no, and another sort of 25% that are not sure. So almost majority, but a significant portion of the people that answered are currently involved or planning to deal with these regulations. So that's a good, we're in the right ballpark, Elmer.
Yeah, and this, some of this information may be new for some of you. It may be very well understood already. But if you do have any questions or any comments, please also add those as we go through this. It'd be nice to have a dialogue when we're finished as well. So feedback is always appreciated. Okay, Matt, I'll carry on.
Yep, please do.
Okay. All right, so now let's talk about some of the costs for stormwater systems. So um, the following summarizes the major cost centers for managing the stormwater systems and really trying to put an envelope around this. You know, the fundamental driver is the day-to-day operation of the systems, cleaning, inspections, maintenance, and the remediation to address emerging and urgent issues that arise on a daily basis is where most of the base costs occur in stormwater management, as well as many of the programs that are created to support the ongoing maintenance, such as CCTV inspections, catch basin cleaning programs, pipe culvert and outfall inspections, typical condition assessments that will be done either on storm ponds or on the infrastructure itself. Erosion and watercourse impacts and other frontline programs intended to keep the system functioning on a daily basis are always very important to be funded and are generally funded through operating budgets. One that's a bit I guess maybe shared, also a bit uncertain at times, is watercourse management, especially where existing watercourses that often have multiple jurisdictions or conservation authority jurisdiction may impact private lands, may have joint relationships or joint responsibilities with municipalities. And those kind of costs can be a little more difficult to predict. The long-term capital improvement plan is also a very, very useful tool and something that all municipalities use with regards to identifying and forecasting larger sort of specific projects to capital improvement projects. And they're often used by coming out of operational findings or assessments, and they identify capacity and condition constraints or future needs, and they create a larger planned scale maintenance and renewal projects. So these 10-year plans are another fairly significant cost component of the stormwater management system. Another interesting one that's emerging or that has been in discussion for at least the last decade is climate change and what climate change means to our communities, our infrastructure. Climate change response planning and funding programs for resilience and review of impact potential is a growing sector. In some cases, from some municipal plans, one in particular that I've had the benefit of reviewing, it was literally identifying almost a doubling of their funding needs, only solely driven by the climate change response plan that they had developed. As our LID inventory increases, so too will the need for ongoing funding to maintain and rehabilitate these features. These are often small, innocuous features within our right-of-ways that do need to be maintained, inspected, monitored for performance. For their reliance of adequate performance is what actually helps mitigate downstream issues with the collection system. And historically, the largest of the rehab programs, the planned sediment removal needs, and that needs to be a mainstay of every capital plan, and this has to have available funding as we lose sediment accumulation, storage capacity in these aging ponds. It's much better to have that funding available and identified in a capital plan rather than recognizing it as an urgent need when other performance issues emerge and there's realization that capacity is lost. Although there is a smaller demand for funding, and that's around the administration costs, that still is a real cost as well. And it's those programs that support the typical municipal administrative functions, revenue generation, the tax revenue generation, programs around bylaw enforcement, and all the elements around the administration, IT. All these things are costs that are indirectly related to stormwater management, and may be recoverable to some degree if a municipality chooses to identify them. So what is the cost of stormwater management? And often these costs are not easily identifiable in municipal budgets, as they are either too small to separate out, or they're delivered in conjunction with other programs such as roads or capital projects, or are spread over other services where the overlap, such as sanitary and storm sewer systems, may be less visible. So depending on in every municipality, although there are very standard ways of presenting capital budgets or annual budget programs for municipalities, there are still a lot of nuances as to how these costs are covered, how they're captured, how they're reported, and where they're presented in the budgets. Uh, so as the need for more sustainable funding grows and as the demand increases, these new costs are now impacting the existing funding models and driving other program costs that used to be really less affected. So that's then driving other pressures. And to assess that, these costs appear to be emerging into, we have been creating a database of defined stormwater programs to assess the cost components identified for funding and how these funds are then subsequently separated and collected from general tax revenue. So really this graphic here is a presentation of known programs that we've been able to identify and differentiate as truly funded solely for the purpose of stormwater management. And this is 2023 dollars. So some information that's been coming out of our ongoing monitoring of these emerging stormwater programs is some metrics that you can take with you and use to apply to your own communities to see if a program is right for you. Typically now the average cost per household as a surrogate comparator is about $125 per year for a revenue charge for stormwater management. But it does range. It ranges from as low as $40 in some areas to upwards of $220 now. We are seeing in the last couple of years some significant cost pressures in the programs that do exist, the existing programs as well as the new programs. Some that we've helped bring to implementation, as well as others that are just being renewed through changes in capital needs. So the approach to the $200 per household range is becoming more and more common. And if you look at this on a per population basis, a similar metric that may be useful. So you're looking at approximately $400,000 per 10,000 of population as an annual revenue stream to sustain a reasonable stormwater management plan. But then again, they range from as low as 130 to almost $750,000. And you can see the disparity in the graphic as well, from the communities as small as less than 100,000 to one community that's approaching 500,000 in population. Just to give you some idea as to what a reasonable range could be for a launch of a program. And what does that mean now? So once we've identified our costs and we get a handle on it, what we think is sustainable, how do we actually communicate that? So once these are forecasted, the best thing to do is create a 10-year plan and recognize the cash flow. And this is a very common approach for capital plans for most municipalities looking in the longer term, recognizing that we can't solve our problems in 1 or 2 years, and also that the understanding of that longer term forecast is very helpful in planning for various charges or various revenue fees and program developments. So as this is a typical analysis provided to our clients to communicate the profile over time. This graph presents the costs in the bar in the bars of this chart, and it includes in this case both capital and operating costs. You can see the operating cost as a relative number at the bottom, very small portion of typically of the capital costs, and also the varying nature of the capital costs year over year as a function of which projects are coming to the program in each year, the size of those projects, and how best the municipality can balance these annual cost variations. But cost variations in a capital plan, as you all may know, is very common. It's a very difficult thing to actually really smooth out. Another key element of this funding strategy approach is what's appearing in here is a gray line. The upward trending line is what would be the annual revenue collected, and in this case is modeled with consistent annual increases. This can be presented as a constant rate or step rates as planned intervals, and is always tailored to the needs of the municipality in considering other programs and general budget policies. So again, part of the modeling of this financial plan is really driven by what municipal priorities are, municipal policies are, and what they're trying to achieve at the end of the day. The most important communicating piece of this graphic is the gold line. And this is the reserve balance generated from this cash flow. And the goal is to set, in this case, to match the reserve balance to the annual revenue at the end of the planning period. So the real important target is at the final stage of this plan, the ninth year. And the reserve balance targets can be something that is set by policy or that is affordable by the plan. So in this case here, the reserve balance is intended to and has been funded to meet the average revenue stream at the end of the program. And that just gives you some sense as to what the program might look like. There are challenges with this. Reserve balance targets can be whatever the policy may be. However, you know, if you have either a negative reserve at the beginning of a program or no existing reserve, or the capital demands are incredibly high at the early parts of a program, the reserve will dip into a negative state, which will drive the pressures for the end value. And this is always the give and take of trying to work through a program with a municipal client, where you know, part of our support is to identify an appropriate target for reserve balance at the end of the planning period, as well as how the rates collected may generate that reserve balance, and what the probability of actually succeeding in that goal is. And like most capital forecasting exercises, this is also a rolling effort, and the 10-year picture is extended every year. In my experience, this approach generally results in accelerated reserve accumulation, as the initial plan for any new program is always, if not often, overstated and overambitious. So where program delivery is anticipated to be as forecast, you know, if only 60 to 80% of that plan is actually executed, and as long as those surplus funds are put into the reserve that we're trying to create here, often the reserve balances can be accumulated fairly quickly, and within the first 5 to 7 years, there can be a substantial accumulation of funding that can either augment the rates or minimize future pressures for increases. And it's an interesting nuance in this process, where the fear of not having enough reserve has to be balanced with the reality or the practicality of delivering an aggressive capital and operating program that may not necessarily be in a mature state at the beginning of the program. So some of the typical programs that we all, I'm sure, have in our municipalities, or if not, are definitely in the process of trying to bring these to the fore, include things like asset management planning, which have been regulated for some time now and are a very important cornerstone of understanding future cost pressures and infrastructure needs. The operation maintenance planning, and now formalizing operation maintenance manuals, at least from a refresh perspective. Many systems have operation and maintenance manuals, and of course, with our qualified and certified operations and maintenance staff, especially on the water and wastewater systems, have a lot of system experience in how these systems operate. Sewer use bylaw enforcement and having fulsome sewer use bylaws is a very important tool for stormwater quality control in particular. And then the monitoring performance reporting plans and requirements. Public engagement and education is always a valuable program to have in place. And then the long-term planning and capital program for renewal and growth, which is often part of municipal capital plans. Reserve funding may or may not be an element, especially for stormwater systems, and that's something that should be considered as a necessity going forward for municipalities that may not have dedicated reserves for their stormwater programs. And emergency response and community protection planning, which is also very much a tool that's in existence for many, if not all, municipalities. Matt, back to you.
Yeah, so I think this is I'm interested to see the result of this poll. do you have does your jurisdiction have a dedicated stormwater funding mechanism? I think this is going to be a mixed bag. Maybe more on the no side than yes is kind of the way it's been trending in the past, but I imagine that will change. But we'll give folks a couple uh, minutes to answer this one, or a couple seconds to answer this one. Yeah, it's trending much lower. So in terms of what we have so far, only, I mean, less than 10% say yes, that they have a dedicated stormwater funding mechanism. 50% say no, and then there's a lot of folks that probably don't get involved with this that are not sure, but that's probably not surprising, at least in terms of the number that actually have a dedicated stormwater funding mechanism and will be of interest going forward, I imagine.
Yeah, that's very good, Matt. And it's interesting that hopefully some of this information that you're receiving through this webinar can be used to give you a starting point if there's an interest, and definitely at least a sense of the trends in the industry. All right, let's
Back to you.
yeah, there's not much left, and I appreciate the attendance is holding well. So I thank you all for that. Yes, so sustainability and affordability, the big question, right? So every community and every council has to consider the cost benefit of stormwater management. And I think this is the key. This is actually, if those of you that may be in the GT, this is actually Lakeshore Avenue down by down at the bottom of where High Park is essentially. This was an event I think in 2019, and that is literally Lakeshore Drive. So these are things that happen unfortunately in our communities. And that vulnerability and the need for infrastructure and resilience is something that we need to decide on and work with and create the messaging and communications that allow us to balance that sustainability and affordability questions. No two programs are ever alike, and no two systems are ever the same. And creating what we're trying to do is create some consistency or some predictability in what funding needs might be and what the next steps might be in trying to find a balance and recognition of at least what the information is saying with regards to our environment, community, and the risks and the costs that might be related to those aspects. So where can we start? So, what are the low-hanging fruits that are available? First, it's important that you understand the cost pressures and program costs you are facing and what the incremental cost increases may be to reach your stormwater management goals. And it really is a question of incremental costs. Every municipality is putting some level of resourcing to stormwater systems. Is it enough or is it adequate? Engaging the community is an important aspect of understanding and educating on what is happening in stormwater and what is possible together. Again, the notion of engagement is really communicating with, educating, and sharing information. And the community is the reason why these systems are in place, and the community has a role to be part of the solution. And in that engagement, we're listening and we know what our community is saying and find ways to respond to them and support what they may need and how they can be part of the bigger solution. So that piece of that circle is important. And it does come back into even the notion of implementing rate programs where now charges are going to be directly levied for things like stormwater. So the first step in this is a desktop analysis. How do we start the analysis? Do a desktop study to see where you are against the benchmark and what might be possible for you. Whether your program is funded out of general revenues, that's the tax revenues, or you have separate funding sources now, knowing what the future needs may be can steer your program and bring in rate changes slowly to avoid community conflict and demonstrate mature fiscal management. And really, it's having that early foresight to at least understand where you are today and what that future pressure may be and how you can mitigate high rate increases. And where a specific stormwater reserve is not available, consider creating one and start the process even if other aspects are not yet in place. The sooner there is recognition of the need for committed funds, the sooner program development can happen. And that first step although relatively simple in many cases, can be very pivotal in moving forward. Some next steps to consider. So as the CLI-ECA program matures, there will be more and more benefits from moving from a general revenue model to stormwater specific rate programs. The next steps are not significant and can go a long way to starting the conversation and leading a path to more sustainable and transparent funding and program delivery. So by starting with a risk profile, you can see what you have and where your program may benefit from some changes and enhancements. From this, you can create a funding needs envelope and see how program decisions can be changed and what needs to happen to recognize the current gap and create plans to close that funding gap. And by comparing with the industry benchmark, you can see if you are in the range of what is to be expected. You can also see if you are undershooting and where your funding needs may be below what others are needing, which may lead to consideration of additional programs to support the system. Underfunded programs do exist, but if your forecast is demonstrating a low level of revenue need and the benchmarks are showing a more sustainable possibility of, say, something from 50 to 80 to $100 per household, then you could start considering those funding sources now and start building your reserves, even though the programs may not be available or in place. And find out where your community is at with stormwater and climate change. Our experience has been that there is little to no resistance to fees for stormwater. The connection to the environment is clear and communities are responding to the willingness of municipalities to do what is needed in facing climate change. So that has been a very refreshing element of this of our work in this field, where communities are actually very accepting of these programs. And when ready, consider the transition to a dedicated funding program with a rate structure tailored to your community, finding the balance between where the infrastructure is and how the community as a whole would contribute to that infrastructure. Just as a note, the implementation from the point of, say, council approval to start the study for or start the investigation for a rate study, typically from that point to actually having revenue flowing can be completed within a period of 12 to 18 months, which is basically one budget cycle. So that kind of program can come in that quickly if there is will and community engagement that supports that transition. So what's next? So if you want to see a program, what a program might look like for you, we are offering a free consultation and baseline condition assessment. Through a brief data collection and interview process, a report can be prepared for you to summarize your cost and revenue profile, similar to the one that you saw earlier in the presentation, and then your community land use characteristics and how this information compares to our benchmark database. And really, it's just looking at what kind of community you are, whether it's in an urban center or maybe more of a rural community, and how those factors can be adjusted to customize your profile. And this will give your team some insights as to the possible next steps and what might be possible in considering a dedicated funding program in the near future. So with that, I think back to you, Matt, with some closing polls.
Yeah, so we've set up a few polls. So this one's more specific on the sort of O&M manual readiness assessment. So as Elmar mentioned, we have a couple of kind of consults that we like to do just based on where municipalities are at with their where they're at in phase of preparing all of their information for the CLI-ECA process. O&M manuals are certainly a key aspect of that. So the first poll is just whether you're interested in a free consult for the O&M manual readiness assessment. So that's the first poll, and then I'll pull up another one, just kind of more general sort of consult looking at some of the other aspects of it. But I'll just give this a few more seconds to populate.
And Matt, if I can ask, while the poll is being wrapped up here, do we have some questions that we can also roll into a Q&A period?
Yeah, we have a few questions. I know we're coming up against two, so if people have to jump off at two, I totally appreciate and and get that. But we do have a few questions, so maybe I'll start teeing those up as well. I'll just maybe if you go to the next slide, Omar, I can launch the next poll as well, and then we can jump into some of uh, uh, the Q&A. So this one just more just like exploring sustainable funding alternatives for the regulations and compliance with the sort of CLI regulations for stormwater management. So they might be a similar group that kind of respond yes to this, but just the last one was more specific to O&M, and this one's just a broader sort of program funding evaluation, if that would be something of interest. Yeah, so I think we can. I'll just leave that poll up, and people feel free to fill that out, and we'll jump into some of the Q&A. And for those out there attending, feel free. There's a Q&A, there's a chat box at the bottom. If you do have any questions, please do to type them in. If you do want to come off and ask your question, verbally, we can take you kind of off mute, and you can ask them that way as well. So maybe Omar, you can answer this first one. Just in terms of the CLI-ECA regulations, are they applicable to public universities? I don't know if that's something that you have experience with directly, but that was one of the questions that came up in the Q&A.
Yeah, they are not. They're not. Well, I say they're not. They're not applicable to non-public. They're municipal focused. And that's actually the first time that I have had that question asked. So I think the answer is no, because you would be considered sort of a separately funded entity beyond a municipality. But I'm happy to follow up with that question and just make sure that that's the case. But I'm sure it's not applicable. It's a good thing to practice.
We starting you out with a hard ball. But we can certainly look into that one and get back to you on that as well. Can you share the presentation afterwards? Yes, so we'll have this webinar is being recorded. Everything will be up on our website after, so you can get the recording there, as well as if you do want the slides, feel free to reach out to our info@civi.ca email, and we can send you some slides as well. Okay. Okay, here we go. From your interactions with municipal departments, what is the prevalent plan for how to fund the requirements for receiving water body monitoring that MECP will be requiring in the coming years?
What is the funding?
Yeah, what is the prevalent plan for how to fund the requirements for receiving water body monitoring?
Mm-hmm. So the question is how to fund it. It's right now what it seems like is most of that funding is just an addition to existing operation programs. I'm not seeing specific, say, capital programs identified for that. It seems to be just part of absorbing the activities that operation staff are doing under their operational programs. So that seems to be the and that probably makes the most sense in the long run, because these really are ongoing programs that should be funded through an operations budget. That being said, though, and depending on what the monitoring plan requirements may be as new information is released by the ministry, there may be benefit in identifying an initial capital plan if there's requirements for acquiring instrumentation, flow monitors, other devices that may have a larger impact on budget. So that would probably be the best way to proceed. If your monitoring plan identifies $100,000 investment in infrastructure and assets and monitoring equipment, then that would be best implemented through a capital plan.
And I know we've talked a little bit about receiving water bodies and some of the work we've been doing, some of the pond monitoring we did a couple of years back, and how that really impacts the performance of and the level of service that we want to have in some of these features. So I think that's going to continue to be a point of conversation as we move forward as well.
Yeah.
Um, can you please provide more details on studies required for CLI-ECA approval process for the municipality? Um,
Okay, so yeah, studies required for approval process. Well, I think it's maybe if I can answer that question, studies required to support the requirements of the ECA, maybe the question that I'm hearing. And it's things like understand really what it boils down to is know what you have, know the condition of what you have, and then from that knowledge, then you're building your program. So a good example would be the CCTV programs that you might do for condition assessment. And you could do for stormwater systems, flow monitoring, if you have constraints in a system where you're trying to identify capacity constraints that may need capital improvements to increase capacity. And probably the biggest one is your storm pond condition assessments, bathymetric survey work, recognizing the performance of your ponds based on their current state, what the forecast useful life of those ponds are, and then how that would inform a future capital plan for cleanup programs. So those are the kind of studies that are probably uh, front and center if they're not already being implemented by your programs, by your existing programs. Then public education, I think, is a real opportunity. And I mentioned the Rainscape program in Toronto, and if you have a moment, just Google Rainscape, you'll see what they do. And there are other programs very similar to that. But I think that frontline investment in education and engagement of the community is something. It's a new, maybe new is not the right word. It's a great place to grow our awareness with the community together. Yeah.
okay, I think that's it on the Q&A board. Um, yeah, I guess, just a comment as well, Omar, and you can do what you want with it. But just in terms of competing, like it's always with the work that we're doing, the competing interests, the competing funding that we have to deal with in terms of transportation and other public works types initiatives, and so it's always a challenge for us to advocate for these types of funding programs. But as you mentioned, when we do that public outreach, there's a lot of understanding and support for these programs, and I think the communities really understand why and the importance of this. So it's just something I think as an industry we need to continue to advocate for and bring that awareness and public knowledge. So hopefully, this type of stuff is one small piece of that, but for others out there that are having those types of conversations, if there's anything we can do to support you in those types of conversations and take a nugget from the experience that mostly Omar has doing this stuff, yeah, by all means, feel free to reach out, because yeah, we do have a lot of positive feedback in trying to implement these programs. So just a quick, I think that came through pretty well in the program, or in your presentation, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate that as well.
Yeah, and it's an important point. When we were asking the question around the your current programs, and there was I think a good chunk of those that didn't know. It's understandable, right? Because a lot of the work that we do in municipalities, or a lot of the roles that the various attendees play, may not necessarily see that information. But even still, it's worth a conversation, uh, helping you see your program and giving you information that might be useful, say, to other people in your team or within the organization. It's always nice to know what the options are, what the it's always it's always that notion of making an investment in something, and it's always a lot scarier than it really is when you actually do the analysis. So sometimes these programs are a lot less painful, or a lot less impactful than what might be thought initially. So by all means, just reaching out and having a conversation sometimes can bring a lot of useful awareness.
All right, well, I'll end it there. We'll stick around for a couple more minutes for anybody that does want to, throw another question in the chat or come off mute, have a little discussion. But again, thank you very much to everybody to take the time to come today. Hopefully, this was very valuable for you, and look forward to seeing you at future events, future webinars, and things like that. So thanks a lot. Take care and have a great rest of your day.